bad as that Greek PowerPoint, but it's still pretty big. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Rome. Once again, the idea is to familiarize yourself with the periods of Roman history. Once again, you're not held responsible for dates, but when we're in a museum, you see something and it is early Republic or late Republic or Augustan or late Empire. I want you to have some sense of how those periods work and how they fit together. So, as we did with the Greek historical lecture, here are the phases of Roman history. Rome, according to legend, was founded in 753. Now, can we come up with this exact date? No. I mean, that's just a tradition. But this is when supposedly two twin boys, Romulus and Remus, on the prowl because they had to escape from their wicked grandfather, etc., founded a brand new city. Romulus and Remus, they got in a fight over it, and so Romulus killed Remus, which is actually a good thing, because instead of having Rome and the Roman Empire, we might have had Rheme and the Rheman Empire, which just doesn't sound right at all. Okay, and he was, by tradition, the first of 7 kings. The reality is only the last 3 or 4 kings are probably historical. The earlier ones are probably legendary. This little town he founded probably never was more than 10,000, 20,000 people. So in the monarchical period, Rome was a very small city-state. And as we'll see in a moment, he didn't really rule as king all on his own. It had been several little neighboring clusters of mud huts that all came together. And the chiefs of the main families were his advisors. In fact, they probably, in true history, not legend, the chiefs, or the heads of the families, the fathers, which in Latin is patres, they chose one of their number to be king. And they continued on as his advisors. Now, the patres were usually the older, respected men of the villages, what we call in Latin senatores, which means old men. So the Senate consisted of a group of chiefs who advised the king. Now, in 509, according to legend, the last king of Rome was overthrown. We won't get into the weeds on this one, into all the details about how his son sexually assaulted, it could have been a Title IX discussion, sexually assaulted a young lady named Lucretia, and how everyone got mad and overthrew the king as a result. Won't get into that. Just know that we have a shift from monarchical government to aristocratic government. Do not let this term republic lead you astray. Rome was never a democratic republic in our sense. Okay? Republic meant that the state belonged to the people. I mean, res publica means public thing, but it was always run by the well-born and the wealthy. So the Senate basically just kind of took over, and they replaced the king with elected magistrates, and we'll talk about that in a moment. All you need to know about early republic is aristocratic government replaced the kings, and this was the period when Rome went from being a small city-state in central Italy to a large city-state that controlled the whole peninsula. So over the course of that, some 36 years or whatever, Rome expanded from central Italy, took a little more, until it controlled the whole peninsula. 264 was the year a great war broke out between, I don't know why that's not green. Anyway, a great war broke out between Rome and a city in northern Africa called Carthage. And actually Rome fought 3 wars with Carthage, and every time she beat her, she took some of her land. So in the first Punic or Carthaginian War, she took Sicily. In the second Punic or Carthaginian War, she took Spain. In the third Punic War, Carthaginian War, she destroyed Carthage and took North Africa. So this was the period of Roman expansion in the Mediterranean. Little by little, seizing territory, organizing it into provinces. And in the West, Romanizing them. That's why those countries all spoke Latin originally. North Africa, not anymore, but Spain, Portugal, France, yes. They still speak bad Latin. It's a French, really badly pronounced Latin. I will say it was bad Latin, because French is beautiful, but it's okay. Then we have the period of the late Republic. The empire, by and large, was acquired in the middle period, not the late period. There are a few things added in the late period, like Gaul or France. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul. But what I want you to know about this period is that it was a period of upheaval. So you would think that gaining an empire is a good thing. Usually it's not. It causes all kinds of problems at home. All this money floods into the homeland, and that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. And then, meanwhile, you have all kinds of political squabbling among the upper classes. Those who conquer provinces or govern them have more influence than those that don't. And anyway, it caused all kinds of problems. And the aristocratic government system broke down. Generals took turns kind of becoming dictators. There were upheavals, popular factions, etc. And by the end of this period, we have to come up with a new form of government that we'll discuss in a moment. Now, you don't need to know this unless you end up doing classics, but this was the beginning of what we call the golden age of Latin literature, Latin being the language of the Romans. And it's interesting that it was a period of such upheaval, but in terms of creativity, both art and literature, it was quite advanced. Now, here's our man, Augustus. He was the last in a series of military leaders, and he brought an end to the civil wars and restored peace and prosperity. We'll talk about his governance system in a moment. He actually reigned from 27 BC to AD 14, which makes what, 41 years? That's a long time. Second half of the golden age of Latin literature, though you don't need to know that. The empire proper is from the time of Augustus till 235. That was the last really secure, solid Roman dynasty, imperial dynasty. I know some of you already know that Rome in the West didn't fall till 476, but the last 150 years were a mess. Okay, so we usually call that the late empire, whereas we're not going to do anything with the late empire except Constantine. But anyway, so there you go. So those are the phases. Once again, you don't need to know dates, but you should know the succession. And as you'll find out on the quiz, maybe one or two things about each period. Okay. Jake, feel free when I go to give them another 5 or 10 minute break. Okay. So that A, they can take a break, but B, they can frantically look at their notes again. Okay, before you hand out the quiz. So let's go back a little bit. Notice that none of this is highlighted. We have this on the study guide, but I just want you to have a feel for what's going on. This is central Italy. So France is about here and Sicily is about here. So this is just the center part of Italy. And there's a river called the Tiber River. You're going to spend a lot of time walking along the Tiber River. We're going to eat on the banks of the Tiber River. You'll know the Tiber River by the time we're finished there next week. Next week we'll see what we're doing when we're done in June. But Rome was an important site because it was on the first ford of the river. Later, of course, they built bridges, but in early history, there was nowhere down here you could cross that river. It's a pretty big river. And so that became an important crossroads, if you will. Now, the people in this area is called Latium, and it was the people of the Latins. The Latins were an Italian people, and they were in about 30 little communities, and Rome was only one of those originally. To the north, or to the northwest, is a region called Etruria. And I have a slide or two on this because it really influenced Roman architecture and art. And when we're in the Capitoline Museum, you'll see some Etruscan things. Okay, you don't have to worry about Sabines and Campanians necessarily. And I've already mentioned this to you. There was a legend that a man named Romulus founded Rome with his brother. Historically, at least from the archaeological record, we know that there were 7 hills, and each one of those hills had a different little village on it. And probably what happened is the first king, whether he was named Romulus or not, we don't know. The first king was probably selected by the chiefs of those 7 villages to become rex, or king in Latin. And the chiefs continued on as his advisors or helpers. You always hear that term Senate when you talk about Roman history. Even in the imperial period, there's always a Senate. Okay, so the Etruscans, once again, nothing's highlighted, nothing's in color. I didn't put any of this in the study guide, but I want you to be aware of it. If Rome is right here on the Tiber River, see how it's on the border between the Latins and the Etruscans? The Etruscans were the most advanced people in Italy in the Archaic period. Their language is nothing like the other languages in Italy. In fact, it's not even Indo-European, if our linguist friends know what that is. It's probably related to Lydian and languages in Asia Minor or Turkey. But they were quite advanced. They started to expand to the north and to the south, so they overran the Latins, even got all the way down to by Naples. So that was the region they controlled at the highlight. And their culture was very, very involved. We tend to look at things and say, oh, the Romans just borrowed Greek stuff and gave it different names. The reality is about 1/3 of the Greek influence was mediated by the Etruscans. The Etruscans were very rich and they traded with the Greeks and they picked up a lot of Greek culture that way. But there are some things that are actually more Etruscan than Greek. So we'll look at the Parthenon in great detail when we're there. But a Greek temple was always longer than it was wide. In fact, there's a formula. It's x by 2x plus 1. So if you have 6 columns on the short side, you have to have 13 on the long side. That's just how the Greeks did it. Etruscan temples were usually wider than they were deep. They were built on a high podium. And they, to the untrained eye, that just looks like a temple, little columns and a triangular roof. But there are some very big differences. One other thing that was a big difference is the Etruscans had a very high view of women. Women had a better status among the Etruscans than they did among the Jews or the Greeks or the Babylonians. Egyptians, it's hard to say because noble Egyptians had a lot of influence. That's probably where the Romans got their view of women. So Roman women could own property, they could testify in court. I mean, they just had higher status than Greek women did. And that's why I have this particular thing here. Greeks almost never have pictures of men and women together. Now, some of this is deformed by who wrote the literature and who made the art. What we should probably more correctly say is upper class Greeks didn't do much with their women. They kept them locked up at home, preserved their virtue, etc. And they spent way too much time with each other, which is probably why they had broad lifestyles. But actually, I remember giving a lecture on this for the Women's Studies Institute when I first got here. Women in Antiquity is actually one of the things I did in grad school. We have a few funerary inscriptions for middle and low class Greeks. And it's interesting that the lower classes seem to have a much more positive view of women than the upper classes. And so you have these loving, wonderful funerary epitaphs. A man loses his wife and he just goes on about how much he loves her and his life will never be the same without her and what a difference she made in his life. You never get that with Plato. All he talks about is his drinking buddies. But we're not talking about the Greeks. They're messed up. We're talking about the Romans. They're cool. Okay. So we'll talk about, for instance, the Emperor Augustus's wife, the lovely Livia, who's the topic of my doctoral dissertation. The empresses had a lot of influence. Roman religion was based on the Etruscan model more than the Greek. It's true that the Romans adopted a lot of the mythology, the stories about the gods from the Greeks. But the gods themselves are more Etruscan than Greek. And the ritual forms that the Romans used were more Etruscan than Greek. So there are a few things we can point out when we're there. But the Greeks did influence the Romans quite a bit. And that's because in the Archaic period, the Greeks had settled southern Italy and Sicily. And in fact, this city here, where are you? Neapolis, is our Naples today. This is very close to Rome. Rome is right here. And so Rome started to get Greek influence. In fact, its alphabet is derived from the Greek alphabet. They probably first came upon it through these Greek colonies. And that picked up all of that process of talking. Now, we talked a little bit already about how the monarchy was overthrown. You don't need to know the names of the terms. You don't need to have consul down under your belt, although some of you already know that. But when we get to the Capitoline Museum, we will see portrait busts of important consuls. In fact, this was the fellow, one of the first consuls of Rome. He was the one who was credited with having overthrown the last king, Tarquin Superbus. So here's just a little bit of stuff that you can kind of review on your own to understand what the Republic was, etc. All right, this is the early Republic. So Rome starts out, that little tiny dark brown blob was the monarchy. All the rest of this is the early Republic. So you can see over that 136 some years it expanded to take over the whole peninsula. This represents one half of Roman expansion in the Middle Republic. That city I mentioned, Carthage, not on your list, is right here in what we call Tunisia today. First Punic War, Punic means Phoenician. Carthaginians were actually Phoenician colonists from Lebanon. They got Sicily. And then a little bit before the Second Punic War, they picked up Sardinia and Corsica. Second Punic War, they picked up Spain. Third Punic War, they picked up North Africa. What's more interesting for a lot of the things we're doing, because we're so focused on the Near East, is the other half of expansion. When Rome conquered one by one the great Hellenistic kingdoms. Oddly, in the case of Pergamum, does anyone know how they got Pergamum? This wasn't a case of conquest. Yeah, the last king, Attalus III, in his will left his kingdom to the people and Senate of Rome. Oh well. Okay, so there you go. Now, you don't need to know all of these details. This was just to give you a sense. The late Republic was a period of upheaval, and this upheaval was largely caused because of the destabilizing effects of acquiring an empire. Mostly because of economic changes, both the money flooded into Italy, which made the rich richer and the poor poorer, but also because the armies were originally citizen militias. And when you were just an Italian city-state or republic, you could just fight during the summer. So you'd plant your crops in the spring, in the summer you'd fight your neighbors, in the fall you'd go home and harvest your crops. But if you're fighting in Spain or Judea, you're not just gone for the summer. You're gone for years at a time. And so one of the economic problems in the late Republic was the small farmers were ruined. I guess these Roman farmers just aren't as hardy as our Mormon pioneer farmers. Because you know what? You could live on the muddy river near St. George, barely surviving in the hot desert, and your husband could be called on a mission, be gone for 5 years, and you and your 9 boys would somehow make the farm work. Some Mormon pioneers managed to pull this off when their husbands were called on missions for multiple years, but Roman women just couldn't do it for some reason. Maybe if they had the gospel, I don't know. I'm just joking. I'm on drugs, you may remember. One thing that I did highlight, though, is this one in red, so I definitely want you to know this. What's a demagogue? Don't give me an example. You can give me an example before 1949. Pompey, well, Hitler, Mussolini. Okay, these are leaders who become dictators because they appeal to people, particularly disenfranchised people in the Rascals of Italy, for instance. Okay, who follow them no matter what. So you have these demagogues who kind of marshal the rage of the disenfranchised and the poor and the marginalized. But you also have great generals who use the military forces to get what they want. So you have 2 different kinds of dictators in Rome in this period. It was a horrible period of upheaval and civil wars. You'd have generals fighting each other, not only in Rome, but throughout the empire. Which is why we end up having, when someone finally wins one of these civil wars, transition to a new system that can handle empire better and can channel the ambition of one man in a way that's not quite so offensive to everyone else. Now, I felt bad talking about naked people last time so much. I'm not about naked people, except to say that this isn't what Romans usually are into. That's kind of a Greek thing. Okay, Romans usually have very dignified men in their funny little robe called toga. But one of the things that was upsetting about the late Republic is some of these generals and governors who spent so much time in the East kind of went native, kind of went Greek. So if a Hellenistic king could claim he was God, like the pharaohs kind of thought they were the son of Horus or something, these generals came back and said, how come you don't treat me like a god? And they saw lots of naked statues in Greece. They wanted naked statues themselves. Now this one we actually happen to know, and we think this is Sulla, that when he first put this statue up, Romans laughed at it. Because this wasn't their, you know, it'd be like, if I put a statue of me up naked, you know, who's going to think that's cool? I mean, why my wife would like that one. So anyway, well, we'll move on. But the Kaplan Museum is full of these. And you don't need to know all the names, but they don't look happy, do they? He does, because he won. They're always fighting and always losing, and it's an upsetting time. Julius Caesar is a really cool guy. We'll talk a little bit about him on site. I mentioned Pompey the Great, and Caitlin just mentioned him. He was a Roman general who actually conquered a lot of the East. So the Seleucid Empire in Syria was conquered by him, etc. He was the one who had the Alexander the Great complex. Remember I told you about Alex's hair? Look at that. He's got some lard in his hair to give him that kind of faux calic. Okay, well, enough of that. Now, this is just something you can file away, and I'll have some stuff for you to read in May on this. The town center of Rome was called the Forum. It's called Agora in Greek. It's called Forum in Latin. And it built up over time. The Forum was first established in the monarchy. They grew during the early and the mid-Republic. But in the late Republic, particularly under the rule of Julius Caesar, really was developed. Caesar was known as a great builder. And so you see here this open square with these buildings that were courthouses. They're called basilicas, which is a big open hall with aisles on the side so people could come in and out during the court case without disturbing the proceedings. So the judge would sit at the front in a rounded area called the apse and try these cases with people coming and going the aisles. Now some of you know about history, art history, say, wait a minute, I thought basilica was a church. That's because Christian churches were based on this public building plan of Rome. But there are conventional temples in there as well. Now, although Julius Caesar built a lot in and around the Forum, the reality was it wasn't big enough for what he wanted. So he built a new forum that he called the Forum of Caesar. Just named it after himself, which is kind of offensive to the other aristocrats. He was offensive to the other aristocrats in a number of ways. They ended up stabbing him one day. But anyway, he built this with the temple of his great-great-great-great-grandma in it, Venus the Mother, Venus Genetrix. So that's just going to give you a sense of the kind of things I'm going to show you next week when we do our Rome kind of preview. Okay, this man is very important. As I mentioned, Julius Caesar, although he was a successful military dictator, quite a good builder, and actually popular among the lower classes. Common people loved him. His equals did not. The other aristocrats and senators didn't like him. They thought he was trying to become a king. So on the Ides of March 1544 BC, a dark day, he went to the Senate once, and while he was just kind of reading some letters, a bunch of the senators came up to him with knives, and they stabbed him to death. Now, Julius Caesar didn't have a child, not a legitimate child. He didn't have, he did not have a Roman son. He did have a daughter named Julia. But he did have an illegitimate Egyptian son. He had had an affair with Cleopatra, but if you're an illegitimate Egyptian, you can't become dictator of Rome. So what he did in his will is he found his nearest male relative, who was his grandnephew, his sister's grandson. And in his will he said, if I die, I want to adopt my grandnephew, whose name was Gaius Octavius. So this is what we call posthumous adoption. Roman adoptions were always of adults. See, we want to adopt babies usually, although it's very nice to adopt children because they need homes too. But we usually adopt babies because we want to act like, it's always ours and that kind of thing. But Romans didn't want to do that because babies died. Half the time they died. So you didn't adopt someone unless you knew he was going to live. Okay, so they adopted adults. Plus, you don't want to adopt a numbskull. Okay, you want to adopt someone who's clearly smart and capable. So you find a young man, 20, 30 years old, who's really successful, say, hey, come be my boy. And he's a Roman, so you don't have to get nervous that something untoward is going to happen. If we were a Greek, I'd be worried. But Romans, no problem at all. So anyway, Octavius gets the name Octavian, which means, used to be Octavius, but now he's Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And he's the one who later becomes the Emperor Augustus. So as I said, Julius Caesar was assassinated, and his will adopts Octavius, who becomes Octavian. Now that's a name you should know. But Octavian wasn't the only person that worked with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar had a couple of generals, including one named Mark Antony. Mark Antony thought, what do you do me? Well, why can't I at least rule the Roman Empire? So these two end up having a great big war. They tried for a while to get along. Octavian took all of this. Antony took all the green. This other guy named Lepidus, you never hear from again, took that part. He's kicked out quickly. But these two end up fighting a real big battle right by this island, this green island, a place called Actium. And at the Battle of Actium, well, let me just say one other thing. Notice that Egypt's not a Roman province yet. It's the last Hellenistic kingdom left. It was ruled by a woman named Cleopatra. And Cleopatra and Mark Antony had an affair. So when it became clear that Octavian was going to invade Greenville from Redville, Antony said, hey, sweetie, can you send me, 50 ships and some troops and help me fight this guy? So Cleopatra and Antony sailed up to here, and Octavian sailed down to there. And in this great big battle, where Octavian won, which sent Antony and Cleopatra scurrying back to Egypt, where Antony killed himself with his sword, Cleopatra had a misadventure with a basket of figs that had a snake in it. I mean, she wanted this to happen, so this is how she committed suicide. And Egypt becomes a province of the Roman Empire, and Octavian becomes the sole ruler of the whole thing. The real question was, how do you rule the Roman Empire without the other senators thinking that you're trying to become king? How can you avoid the mistakes that Caesar and other military dictators in the Roman Republic made in kind of rubbing their rivals' noses in the fact that they had lost the Civil War? And Octavian comes up with a really kind of clever system. He, very melodramatically, in 27 BC, called the Senate together in January, early in the year, and said, I hereby restore the Republic to the Senate and people of Rome. But he planted his buddies in the Senate and said, no, we'll have more wars, we'll have more late Republic. No, stay, stay. I won't. Stay, no. Stay kind of. Okay. Let's split it. And so Octavian took half the provinces and let the Senate have the other provinces. But that's the only real division there was. Because in reality, Octavian kept everything else. What he formed was a government, which is what I call a disguised monarchy. He never used the title king, nor did he use the title emperor, although that's a name we always give him and his successors. There is no Roman title of emperor. There's a title called imperator from which we get emperor, but what that actually means is triumphant general. Okay, so there really wasn't a position of emperor. There was instead the rule of the first citizen. Princeps in Latin means first, so principate means the rule of the first citizen. So it's disguised, it's not in-your-face kind of monarchy. Now, he got this new name, which is a really cool name. The Senate voted a name which is triumphant general, divine guy who increases, Caesar. He kept his adopted dad's name because all the common people like that. So we know him as Augustus Caesar. But as I said, the form of government was not a monarchy, it was the first citizen. By the way, when he split the provinces with the Senate, he kept all the provinces with armies. So, even though they say they're splitting the provinces, they're not splitting the armies. Yes?
So he started out as Augustus, became...
No, he started out as Octavius, becomes Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, we call him Octavian. And then, when he restored the Republic, he got a name. I mean, even though he says I'm just first among equals, you go to a party, what's your name? Oh, Brutus. What's your name? Sulla. What's your name? Oh, triumphant general, divine guy who increases Caesar. I mean, his name just kind of always made him an overweening presence, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just making sure he was the same guy.
Same guy. Octavius becomes Octavian. It's actually Gaius Julius Caesar. When you get adopted, you take your dad's name.
Okay.
And then Augustus. He established the Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. Ended civil wars. He did have one or two bad wars with the Germans, but we kind of ignore those in history. Yes, Rachel?
What's the weird baby?
The weird baby. It's probably his great uncle, Cupid.
What?
Because Julius Caesar is descended from Venus. Okay, so Aeneas and Cupid were half brothers. Okay, and so anyway, that's who it is. Say hi. But anyway, that's who it is. But Roman peace is a big deal. In fact, he uses the title Prince of Peace, which sounds an awful lot like a messianic title. It's very interesting that a lot of the titles that Isaiah and other prophets gave the Christ were titles that an actual ruler in that period used. So you've got this worldly kind of savior figure, saving us from civil wars and economic dislocation, etc. But then you have the actual one going on. But I'll try not to preach religion to you right now. Say that for Mars Hill, for our devotional. So these brown provinces are the ones Augustus keeps. And the tan ones are the ones he let the Senate keep. Notice that they're all in the interior. They don't have armies and things. Well, he builds lots of stuff, and that's where we're going to spend some time. Let me get oriented here. So here's the original Roman Forum. Here you see Julius Caesar built a little extra forum. Augustus builds another one, and this is now open. We're going to be some of the first people to go there. It used to be you walked by what they called the Imperial Forum, the Forum of Augustus and the Trajan and things. You could just look down in them, you couldn't go in them. But we've added something new to our itineraries, so that would be fun. He had a house on a hill called the Palatine, which is kind of the east bench of Provo. not a Provo, East Bench of Rome. Lots of rich people lived there. But Augustus kept buying their houses, or his wife bought their houses. So between the two of them, they ended up owning the whole hill. Palatine is where we get our word palace. Okay, so the private homes of Augustus and his wife Livia become the palace, if you will. There are some other things that we'll see. In fact, the original Pantheon was built by Augustus's best friend Agrippa, but that's not the one we're going to see. We're going to see the one that Hadrian later rebuilt. So this is the one we're going to be able to get into. It had a temple to Mars the Avenger. When he defeated Mark Antony and some other ones, he said he was avenging his father. So that will be kind of fun. This is it again. So this is a model of what it looked like. And we're going to be able to walk under the steps. I can't wait. Okay. Now, he was succeeded by 4 emperors, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, and Nero. The only name you need to know for your reading quiz is Nero. But be kind of aware of those. So if we're in the Capitoline Museum and I say, this is Tiberius, Augustus' stepson and successor, you say, oh, he was one of those Julio-Claudians, right? Okay, so anyway, these are the successors. Interestingly enough, Tiberius was his stepson. Tiberius' mom was Augustus' second wife, Livia. All of these emperors are actually related to Livia. And if you get me talking, I'll tell you a lot about it. Or I can refer you to a 343-page dissertation. But one of the things I have added to our itinerary, the first night we're there, and we'll talk about this next week, is the famous Ara Pacis. So we've already got our tickets, so it's good to go. And this was built by Augustus to commemorate the fact he ended the civil wars and brought peace and prosperity to the Roman Empire. But it also celebrates the fact this would not have happened if it weren't for him and his family. So he puts his family all around his family.
So maybe I just didn't find it or study it right, but what's the significance of, you say, Nero?
Okay, so Nero's the famous emperor that burned Rome. You ever heard the story about the Great Fire of Rome in 64?
Okay.
And he also was a prima donna and an opera star and all kinds of things. So you'll hear me say funny stories about him when we're there.
Okay.
So he was kind of artsy. Not that there's anything wrong with being artsy as long as you don't burn down cities and kill people. So Nero is just, because that's probably the most infamous of the emperors. So Augustus is the most upright and famous, and Nero's the most infamous. And that ends the family, because Nero's overthrown, and that ends the family.
Okay.
And we move to the next family, the Flavians and Mopa. This is the Ara Pacis, which has been totally reconstructed and put in a really nice glass building. And this is what I was saying. Here are members of the imperial family depicted at the dedication of this altar. Peace becomes a personification, becomes a goddess to the Romans. Augustan peace means the peace that loves Augustus, or the peace that Augustus established. The altar is actually in the middle of this square building, open to the sky, and there are all of these carvings on them. And, you won't be tested on this, but we'll discuss them when we get there. This is supposed to be like Demeter, Mother Earth. It represents the prosperity of the soil that comes back because of Augustus. But interestingly enough, it looks just like his wife Livia. In fact, this altar was dedicated on her birthday. So when Nero was overthrown, there's a period of civil war for about 1.5 years. It's called the Year of the Four Emperors. But the one who is victorious in that civil war is a guy named Vespasian. And Vespasian was succeeded first by his son Titus, only ruled a couple years, and then his other son Domitian. So the Flavian dynasty is much shorter than the Julio-Claudian one, but it's very important to us for a couple of reasons. One, you read a little bit about the Jews under Roman rule for today. And after being under the rule of the Herod family and then a few governors, the Jews revolted. And Vespasian and Titus were the ones who put that revolt down. So that's really important from a Near Eastern perspective. In fact, one of the things we'll see is a commemorative arch to Titus's victory. And when we walk under it, we're going to walk right through it. When we walk under it, you will see carved a triumphal parade commemorating their victory over the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem. And these are the temple treasures. The menorah, the table of showbread, the altar of incense. All of these things were hauled to Rome. They used the money that they got from, basically raping Judea to build a huge amphitheater. Now, I'm particular about this, so we just will deal with this now. A theater is a semicircle. That's where you watch a play. An amphitheater is an oval. Okay? Unless it's an oval, it is not an amphitheater. Amphitheaters were used for gladiatorial combats. This one was used for naval battles. They'd fill it with water and have naval battles. It's an amazing place, and this is the first thing we're going to do that day. We're going to go early to get in line. All of this stuff that was under the floor had little trap doors so they could bring up animals and lions and tigers and bears, oh my, and pump water in and do all of these things. By the way, the reason this is a mess, why it's half gone, is not just because things fall apart over time. That's true, they do. It's because in the Middle Ages, and especially the Renaissance, the popes used this as their stone quarry. Why go and carve your own stones when you can just take these away? So that's really kind of sad. So it's an amphitheater, and it was built by the Flavians. Its name is the Flavian Amphitheater. Do you know that we don't have any attestation of it being called the Colosseum until the Renaissance? And that's because historically there was a colossal statue of Nero. Before he was overthrown, he built this huge naked gold statue of himself as the sun. And when the Flavians overthrew him, they took his head off and put the sun's head back on. But what people would say is, I'm going to the amphitheater at the Colossus, the colossal statue. So that's where the word Colosseum comes from. Okay, so if you're speed dating Friday night, going to a list of possible partner candidates, and he keeps saying Colosseum, he says, well, it's called the Flavian Amphitheater, and if he doesn't adjust, dump him. Okay, this is the last thing that I need to go to choir practice. After Domitian was overthrown, he was kind of like Nero, he was kind of a mad boy emperor. We have a period of the so-called good emperors. You don't need to know this unless you take Roman history from Dr. Peake. But they're sometimes called the adoptive emperors. And people say, oh, they're so good that they just choose the best man for the job rather than letting their son take over. They picked someone and adopted someone because they didn't have any kids. These two, because they don't like women, it's hard to have kids unless you spend some time with a woman. But this one, because they didn't have any sons. When we finally get one who did have sons, he had like 12. He lets his son, Commodus, take over. If you've seen Gladiator, that's the Emperor Gladiator, and he's a mess. Now, the two and a half you need to know are Trajan. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent. He conquered Mesopotamia and Romania and things. And he built some famous things in Rome that we'll look at. A new forum, a column with him on top of it. Now St. Paul's on it. And then Hadrian succeeded him. He rebuilt the Pantheon that we're going to see our first night in Rome. Marcus Aurelius, he does have a statue of himself on a horse, and he has a column as well. But he's actually famous because he was a philosopher. It's because he had to spend like 15 years fighting in the winters of Romania. And to comfort himself, he read philosophy. So these are the conquest of Trajan. This is the Forum of Trajan, which we get to go in now, which I'm excited about, and that's what it would have looked like. And I'll have stuff for the 353 website when we get there. That's his column for St. Paul. This is the Pantheon. This is cool. This is really cool. And that's Marcus Aurelius. Okay? You good? Okay, let me answer the question.